Welcome back. You're still watching Business Morning. Our conversation today is on the CBN succession implications for monetary policy. And I have here with me in the studios two economists who have been having this conversation with me in the last couple of minutes, and they're still here. Henry BOYO, he's an economist, and Dr. Ayodele Teriba, he's the Chief Executive Officer of Economic Associates. Thank you so much, gentlemen, for sticking around.
Thank you, Harry.
Well, let's quickly talk about one of those reasons why why the central bank governor, Sanusi Lamido Sanusi, had to continue to tighten monetary policy. He said it was to ensure a stable exchange rate and price stability, as the case may be. And at some point, we've actually had this conversation, Mr. BOYO, once upon a time when you were
Several
here.
times.
Several times we've had this conversation. But just before we get down to it again, let's quickly listen to something he said recently.
We have stability that is very, very easy to calculate. In 2009, when I became governor, inflation was 15.6%. The stock market had lost 70% of its value. One third of the banks were about to collapse. The official exchange rate was 145. At the BTC, it was being sold at 190. It's very easy when you have established stability for people to start screaming that you're holding policy too tight. Okay, you've had a stable exchange rate for 2 years. We've brought inflation from 15.6% to 8.2, going to below 8 in December. Okay, we have the stock market has been up 30%. People want a stable exchange rate. They want to have reserves. They want to have low inflation, and they want to have low interest rates. I'm not a magician.
CBN Governor Sanusi Lamido Sanusi. Well, Dr. Teriba, Mr. BOYO, you've actually listened to him. He's, somehow or the other, because of the tightening of the monetary policy, we've been able to achieve stable exchange rate. We have single-digit inflation.
We had him. We
okay.
don't need to,
okay. So let's start this conversation.
But that illustrates the trouble that Nigeria has today. There was no mention of what's happening to growth.
Employment.
No mention of what's happening to employment. No mention of what's happening to business spending or private spending. That's the economy. We cannot sacrifice real economic developments on the altar of financial markets. Elsewhere, Nigeria is not an island. It's not only Nigeria that is having capital flow volatility. Every country faces it. But the way it's done, where it is done correctly, where economists, put economic issues first and foremost on the table as the goal, and it is the end that justifies the means, is to keep those growth and employment issues in view and set thresholds for these growth and employment issues, set triggers for these growth and employment issues in tackling short-term movements in financial variables, not to abandon economic developments and talk about.
Well, is that what it seems like has happened now, that economic development has been abandoned and more attention was focused on financial development?
When last did you hear the central bank say anything about the economic activity? When last? About growth, about its acceleration or its deceleration, about employment, or about spending? Whether there is enough to spend. How do you make credit decisions if you are not monitoring spending? If spending is weak, inflation will drop. It's not an achievement. And, you have to be careful that we are not on a deflationary path. If you deliver the growth first, if you are saying that monetary activity supports growth, and in spite of it supporting growth, we are still able to maintain stability in prices and foreign exchange and the rest of it, you'll have achieved something.
Okay.
If Nigeria goes on, we've spent 5 years just talking about financial activity. If we go on for the next 5 years, the economy will be doomed.
All right. So, Dr. Teriba, if I come back to you, Mr. BOYO, one of our viewers, Igodaro, actually sends a tweet. It says, Mr. BOYO should tell us which model the CBN should adopt. I guess it's a question as regards comment you made just before we went on break.
Yeah, I will answer Ms. Godaro's question, but I would also want to tackle the issue about what Mr. Lamido Sanusi was saying
Please go
about
ahead.
exchange rates, this one, that one, that one. It's clear that the gentleman is confused. There's no doubt about that. What we are talking about here, what Dr. Teriba is talking about, inclusive growth in real terms and what happens in the financial market and financial stability. They don't have to be discrete. They are actually, in most countries, embedded, intertwined, okay? And unfortunately, Mr. Sanusi doesn't seem to realize this, and he's, on one hand, saying, I'm not a magician, I can't. Then if he's not a magician, he can't do it, should have, you know, nicely stepped off
Okay, so
the
let's
stage.
just quickly answer
But
that question.
but the important thing is that money is central to economic activity. So the control, availability, supply of money is critical. The role for maintaining stability, control, and purchasing value of the money and cost of funds relies with central bank. Unfortunately, if central bank doesn't perform its role very well, you will have a problem like we are having. And because money is critical, it is important that you don't have too much of it in the system at any one time. Historically, over the last 15, 20 years or so, you will have been discussing on this table and on your news bulletins, central bank continuously mopping up money.
Yeah.
That means there's surplus money in the system all the time. And unfortunately, we never ask ourselves, where does the surplus money come from? What I'm trying to show you is that central bank itself is the villain of what is saying, I'm not a magician, I cannot do. Because when you have too much money in the system, you have a problem. And the deliberate action to stop that problem is central bank, is government going back to borrow back its own money. That's a crime in its own. You know, to borrow back your money at 10, 11, 12%, that's a crime. In addition to that, if you have also flooded the system, simple market dynamics of demand and supply, if you have too much of Naira in the system and you have less dollars, you are going to have what? A depreciation of the Naira value. So the question is, who is busy pumping in this Naira supply every time? How does it come? From where is the Agbomagbe bank that this money comes from? And the answer is very simple. You will find that soon after the monetary allocations to the 3 tiers of government have been made in humongous sums of hundreds of billions every month, okay? The next thing you hear on your news at 10 is government is busy, and you say it in very flowery terms to compliment the efforts of the government to borrow back its own money. And the government, the real villain now comes and says, look, I've been doing this for so long and it doesn't work. And you have never come and said, look, for how long has this been going on? For how long has Nigeria's money being treated in this manner? So if you abuse the value or the flow or the supply of money, you are going to have the problems of high rate of inflation. You are going to have a depreciating currency. You are going to have a situation where government borrows back its own money. You are going to have a situation where the poorer Nigerians become, the richer central banks become, which central banks reserves going over $40 billion. Meanwhile, this $40 billion worth of reserves, you cannot use to pay your debt off. You cannot use it as an,
but we know
you
that
cannot appropriate it.
The Central Bank of Nigeria has actually been using those reserves to actually
defend the Naira. That's what you are going to say. They are deceiving you. How can the same person who is putting so much Naira in place and then bringing trickles of dollars to face the huge Naira sums in the market, how can that person say I'm defending the Naira? You are killing the Naira. Simple. No, I want you to respond to that. Don't you think so? That if somebody has the yam and the knife, he puts the Naira in surplus in the market, and then he brings rations of dollars into the market, and the two are facing each other in the market, and the man admits that, oh, I have so much Naira in the system, and that's my problem. Well, don't you think that there would be a depreciation of the Naira? And for the same person to come back and say, oh, I'm not a magician, I don't know how to do it. I think it's a game.
Well, Mr. Boyo, your arguments, I'm very sure, you know, lots of people actually share that view with you, but we actually hope that we can get the CBN, you know, to actually respond to some of the benefit of the doubt, sir. Dr. Teriba, you wanted to add something to...
Well, no, just to clarify, you know, that there is a difference between supervising banks and providing money supply.
Okay.
Now, banking supervision, there is this general notion, you know, that you need a banker because of banking supervision and the rest of it. Banking supervision is not central to central banking. there are prominent central banks that does not supervise banks. An example, Bank of England does not supervise banks. Other agencies do that. So we are not saying that financial stability or banking stability is not important, but it's not as important as economic stability. As a matter of fact, the central bank can be stripped of its banking supervision functions so that the central bank can concentrate on growth management, providing liquidity support for employment. And that's why, I've not read the part in the act that says it must just be a bank. I don't think. I'm sure that economists, there'll be space depending on expertise. So that's why I think Nigeria has to move towards de-emphasizing the role that central bank has to play in day-to-day supervision of banks, because it's not just banks that needs to be supervised. There are other financial institutions that are equally as important as banks, which are not currently being supervised by the central bank. So if you could, go and follow the very good example of the UK, then you have a central bank that concentrates on growth and, tackles its anti-inflation policy in a more constrained way that says, yeah, we could have done this, but if we did this, it's going to hurt growth. Therefore, we won't do it. We will delay. We want growth to reach this threshold before we would act.
Okay, so please comment on this, if you will. Another of our viewers sent in this tweet, Sani Ozovehe, says, an economy that has deficiency in effective demand. Sanusi has always advocated for contractionary monetary policy. Should this continue with the next CBN governor?
Well, you can't have a contractionary monetary policy, as Dr. Teriba has said, at a time that you have a huge pool of unemployment. Okay? We have to recognize the problem of liquidity, excess liquidity, surplus liquidity. Let's take, for example, the case of Zimbabwe. Zimbabwe at one time had, 2-3 years ago, had a 1 billion Zimbabwe dollar, which was equal to $1 US. Why? Because Zimbabwe Central Bank was busy printing out Zimbabwe dollars at its whims and caprices. As a result, the money became worthless. Okay? If I ask you, would you believe that Zimbabwe's rate of inflation today is 1.5%? You wouldn't believe that. If I also told you that the lowest paid official worker in Zimbabwe is getting about $300 US dollars, not Zimbabwe dollars, you probably wouldn't also believe it. And all they did was to get a good central bank governor who knew what it was all about and said, look, we will stop printing our money, as and when we have dollars, okay? We will spend actually US dollars. And they now spend US dollars in Zimbabwe. And suddenly, everything in terms of stability, price stability, has become real. And a situation where you have 1.5% inflation rate and it's not celebrated, and we celebrate 8% inflation rate, a rate that makes a pensioner almost a pauper every 8 or 10 years. Because 8% year-on-year inflation rate means that your money is depreciating or reducing in value or reducing purchasing value by about 8-10% every year. In 10 years, that's 80%. Your pensioner or anybody with static incomes is in big trouble.
All right. So, gentlemen, as much as we'd like to continue this conversation, we're fast spent for time, but I know that we're going to be back here again. This is February, and so many other things are going to come up because we haven't actually looked at some of the possible candidates that can occupy the position.
Let the president.
Let them yes, but you see, the president will eventually, be the person to announce this. But it wouldn't hurt for us to look at possible candidates and what they will be bringing to the table if eventually any of them are picked as the CBN governor. But thank you so much, gentlemen, for coming in this morning. It's been an interesting conversation, as always. Dr. Ayodele Teriba, thank you so much for joining me, and Mr. Henry BOYO. Well, I've been speaking with two economists, Dr. Ayodele Teriba, he's the Chief Executive Officer of Economic Associates, and Mr. Henry BOYO is also an economist, and we'll be looking at the CBN and the CBN's succession and the implications for monetary policy. I'd also like to thank Sani Ozovehe and Igudaro Alonge for sending in their tweets. But that's the program for today. I'm Harriet Agbeni.